Okay, well, I am in England. I'm in the south of England, and it is a blue sky and it's quite warm. So, of course, I've got a really hot, steaming cup of tea because you can never be too careful. All right, so I'll have a little look at the chat as I go along. But yes, welcome. We're going to be talking about Fabric Warehouses. So, this is the T-SQL based service within Fabric for, as the name suggests, data warehousing. But Fabric Warehouses, like any database service or any of these services, they're a bit of a blank canvas, right? Yes, you can bring your own coding, you can bring your own patterns, but it's sometimes very helpful to have another tool that can help you paint the picture, which ultimately is what DBT does. So this is Fabric Warehouses and deploying projects using DBT for Data Weekend and number 7. So obviously, thank you to Kevin, Gethin, Justin, everyone organising Data Weekender and the lovely moderators as well. So a little bit about me. So fancy way of saying I just work for myself. That link tree, Andy Cutler, that's got all my socials, LinkedIn, YouTube, Blue Sky. But I work for myself. It's Data High. It's a small consultancy specializing in Synapse. There's still plenty of Synapse out there. Fabric. There's some Databricks rolled in there as well. And Power BI. Not the clever stuff, not the visualizations, the reporting, the actual useful stuff. I might mostly do the back end, maybe up to the data modeling, I would say. But from a community perspective, I blog over at Serverless SQL. That's nothing connected to Data High. That's all my community blogging that I do on that. And there's a YouTube channel as well. So yeah, last one I did was all about that Fabric open mirroring. But as I said, Mark Price Mayer, if you go search for him on YouTube, he's got all that open mirroring stuff. So today we're going to be looking at what the Fabric and Warehouse service is. Just a few minutes, right? We're not going to spend half an hour talking about what Fabric is and what the Warehouse service is. So I am going to assume that you know some stuff about Fabric, okay? Because we want to get to the good stuff. We want to get to DBT. What is it? Why would we want to use it? That's the question that I've been asking myself over the last, I would say, 6 months, really, with my engagement with DBT. Because DBT is this third-party tool, it works with a bunch of services. It works with Snowflake. It works with Databricks. Anyone can actually go and build a connector for a service. So Fabric is one of those services. Now, there is actually, a DBT Fabric adapter. There's also a Spark adapter, but we're concentrating on the warehouse. We're concentrating on the T-SQL service. Now, it's not perfect. There's some limitations and caveats, and that's no fault of DBT. If anything, it will be the fault of Fabric Warehouse with certain functionality that is and isn't available yet. And I want to get to the demo, right? That's where we're going to have a look at the project. We're going to have a look at how we're building some of these models. We'll explain what models are. And we'll see it in action, see it deploying. We'll load some data. Hopefully, it'll give you a good idea of how DBT and the warehouse work together. So in terms of Fabric, well, yes, it's now been generally available for 18 months. It is Microsoft's premier data analytics service. Now, they're putting a lot of resource into it. And I mean, the first thing I always describe it as, it's adding significant functionality to a Power BI tenant, because Microsoft's other efforts in analytics, or data warehousing and data engineering, Synapse Analytics, they've created a standalone product, grouped other services within that product, and created its own GUI. called Synapse Studio. Yes, you could connect third-party tools to it, but ultimately it was a new interface that you had to work with. Most of the time, data engineers would be using that interface. Not many other people would be. So what Microsoft have done is brought warehousing, data engineering, data pipelines, real-time, machine learning into more of a familiar world where all the business users are going to be using a Power BI front end. They're analysts, the data scientists, the data engineers. I mean, it makes sense, right, to be using an interface that is very, very well known. But unlike all the other services, so Synapse was comprised of several services, each with their own pricing methods, each with their own compute types. So you had to understand how all of those services worked. But Fabric is a SaaS product, software as a service, which means, in effect, you're trusting Microsoft with running the platform. There is some shared services, or sort of shared responsibility, I should say, model in which you're responsible for your data, right? Microsoft is not responsible for you doing silly things and exposing your data to everyone, but they're looking after the infrastructure, right? They're looking after the compute. But it does mean that you don't really have a lot of control. Spark, yes, you can configure different Spark cluster sizes and auto scale policies. But in terms of services like the warehouse, currently we've got no control over the compute. This is an on-demand engine, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the biggest departure is that Microsoft have gone in on this open source storage format. So it's Parquet file format that's backing the warehouse and the Lakehouse service, all being managed by Delta Lake, which is the intermediate layer that manages functionality like transactions. So we've got some ACID compliance. Yes, there's some there's some isolation levels in there. I mean, really, we've only got snapshot isolation, which for a data warehouse is probably the best isolation level that you want. But ultimately, what do we want to do with Fabric? And this is kind of where DBT might come into some areas of this as well, is that the whole point of Fabric is that you've got a whole bunch of source data, third-party APIs, on-premises systems, cloud sources, ERP systems. You want to get all this data together. You want to be able to report, perform machine learning, be alerted when things aren't quite what they seem, when there are anomalies. Ultimately, Fabric gives you an end-to-end data platform solution, different methods for data ingestion and loading, pipelines, data flows, code. I'm not going to go into too much detail, already been through that. We can process data. We've got different methods of landing that data. Microsoft have got a guide in terms of choosing your storage system. Do you choose a lakehouse? Do you choose a warehouse? Do you choose KQL? All dependent on the scenario that you're trying to work with. Ultimately, we're delivering reporting and machine learning, right? This is what I show to clients, really, in terms of getting and rising above the technical part of Fabric and trying to understand all the things that Fabric has. There's a lot. And get to the crux of, well, what do you want to do with Fabric? Now, in terms of the warehouse service, if we look at that specifically, right, so this is, and if anyone is familiar with Synapse Analytics or has heard of the service within Synapse called serverless SQL pools, this is essentially a T-SQL software as a service. And Microsoft is managing the infrastructure. It's also managing the compute. So just like serverless, Fabric Warehouse does not give you any switches to be able to do anything with. You can't choose the compute size other than the main Fabric capacity. So you can't say, actually, within my Fabric capacity, I only want this specific warehouse in this workspace to use 10% of the compute. No, we don't have those controls yet. I hope those controls come, but essentially we have a workload, a T-SQL query comes in. There is a SQL front end. You get a single SQL front end for every workspace that you deploy. It receives the request and it decides through a plan, how much compute do I need to run this command? It'll go off, provision backend compute, run those queries, whether it's retrieving data or modifying data, and that'll be saved into one lake, right? So there's no configuration there, but it's familiar. When we create a warehouse, we're ultimately creating a database. If we connect to a workspace using client tools or SQL client tools like SQL Server Management Studio, we'll see the workspace as if we were looking at a server. And a warehouse will expose itself as a database. We can create tables. Tables have got columns and data types, stored procedures, views, scalar functions. But it does actually properly separate compute and storage. So the storage is Parquet managed by Delta. That is actually exposed for other services to be able to read. Hot off the press in the last few days, we've now got the ability to use Spark to write into the warehouse as well. Very exciting stuff. Extends the use, makes the Fabric Warehouse interoperable with other services. And Delta, this is what is providing the transactional capabilities and also all the other features that Delta has, like time travel. So, for example, Fabric Warehouses were able to restore to a specific point in time. That's all possible because of Delta and because of its state saving in its log files over time. That includes the schema and that includes the data. Delta's cool. If you want to understand how things work in Fabric, go to delta.io. Literally in the top right-hand corner of that website is Docs, and click on the Spark connector, and you can find everything that you need to know about Delta tables. And in fact, that'll help you understand why things work the way they do in services like the Fabric Warehouse that are using Delta. Right, so in terms of warehouses, where does it sit? All right, we're going to be talking about Medallion. I know Nicola already talked about that, but the warehouse really sits on that right-hand side. It sits in whatever layer you want to call the layer that you put your modeled warehouse in with your design of choice. My design of choice is a dimensional model, aka star schemas. So when I'm looking at deploying a warehouse with a star schema in, I'm looking at putting it into this modeled or gold area. We're not going to go into the ins and outs of Medallion in this session. However, that's kind of where it's sitting. Now, we need something to be able to load that warehouse. We can pipe data in using pipelines, or if you really want to, Dataflow Gen 2. I didn't say that, but I'm not really much of an advocate of Dataflow Gen 2s, but they're there. You can use them. Warehouse is a valid destination. We've got pipelines. We've got copy into. Bulk loads data from external to Fabric. And we can write SQL. So if we're familiar with T-SQL, and let's say we've got our own T-SQL frameworks for loading or dealing with things like dimensional models, great, bring that. But you're going to have to work with the fact that there is a subset of T-SQL support that you would find in something like SQL Server, right? Because Fabric Warehouse does a very specific thing. Analytics engineering, which really is where DBT was born from. Now, I don't know whether DBT came first or whether analytics engineering came first, or it was the other way around. But ultimately, Analytics engineering doesn't care about the raw data. It doesn't care about the sources. Analytics engineers is asking the data engineer, hey, can you work with all of those sources and bring them in? We also, here is the set of business rules that we need to get that data into a cleansed state. Then the analytics engineer can pick up that data, right? So our data engineers are working with raw data. We've got our business analysts and our data analysts working on the reporting side of things. We've got this big blank space in the middle where the analytics engineer is taking the cleansed data. So this is deduped, could be enriched with master data. It is fit for consumption downstream. We can model it. So for example, we're going to create dimensional models, and then we can build semantic models. Then there's a slight Venn diagram in terms of the data analysts or report analysts building reports from that model. Perhaps in certain organizations, an analytics engineer might be working with the reporting team as well, so they can understand how the model works. But it's being handed off at that point, right? And this is kind of where DBT sits. Ultimately, whether you want to call it ELT or ETL, it's the T, it's the transform. And actually, that's just a quote literally taken from the DBT website itself, right? Because that's exactly what it does. It transforms. It does a whole lot more than that in when it's transforming. When we have a look at the demo, you'll understand why. But ultimately, it is a framework in which we can connect to data, model how our downstream data model should look like, and DBT does the rest, right? So it lets you build a framework, right? It's the thing that enables you to write your transformations and not have to deal with the schema management further downstream and also the load dependencies. Ultimately, DBT is running the language that the destination system supports. So for example, if you're working with DBT in on-premises SQL or Azure SQL database or Databricks or Fabric Warehouse, it's running the loading processes and all of the schema modification statements on the system itself. DBT is not running on its own compute and loading the data. Yeah. DBT needs somewhere to run. It needs some compute so it can compile the project and ultimately fire the commands off to the destination system. But DBT does not run on compute that does the data loading process itself. Right? This is why you are beholden to understanding what system you're working with to see what DBT functionality you can use and what is supported. The language is when we're dealing with a table or a view, let's say in a destination system. DBT calls that a model. Now, of course, if anyone's building semantic models, yes, it can get a little confusing. I keep saying model instead of project. And in fact, this session says deploy models using DBT, which I guess is kind of correct. Models are tables. But really, we're talking about a project that contains several models. These models are individual artifacts. They're tables, they're views, and we're defining those with a select statement. Now, the most useful thing is it's creating a DAG. You help DBT out by structuring your project in a certain way. We'll look at that in the demo. But ultimately, DBT can work out, okay, so you want to load this table into another table, but I also notice that you've got these other tables being loaded, and I can work out that I need to load these two tables first before I can load this other table. So you don't have to work out the order of precedence in terms of what's being loaded or the DAG. DBT is going to do that for you. And we're removing the need to manage the schema ourselves. We are declaring what we want as a schema in our DBT transformations. DBT is managing the downstream schema modifications, table creations, view creations, altering, so on and so forth. And also we can generate some documentation, right? So DBT can generate docs. You're going to get that as a web page. Incredibly useful. Literally a command that you run to generate the documentation. Now with DBT flavors, if you search for DBT, if you search for, tutorials, so on and so forth, you might find tutorials referencing DBT Core. You might also find tutorials referencing DBT Cloud. You might be a little bit concerned, well, which one should I use? DBT Core, this is the open source version. You download it, you manage it, you install it on your own compute. So for example, I have DBT on my desktop computer that we're using now. I've got it on my laptop. I've got it on a container that connects to and runs what I need. But it integrates into VS Code, which is where I work with it. And it's got some great plugins. So we've got Power Tools, which I'll show you in DBT Core. But this is where you don't have to pay for DBT, right? You download it, but the onus is on you to work with it, to manage it, to orchestrate it in your environment. DBT Cloud, on the other hand, yes, obviously it's got all the features of DBT Core, but because it's a paid service, there's a lot more to it as well. Or automatically integrates into source control. It's got a very nice GUI. I particularly like working in the DBT Cloud GUI. Automatic version control, CI/CD through environments, very, very feature rich. They do have a free offering, and I think that's where, if you just want to kick the tires, right, and you don't want to go through downloading DBT Core and running it, and maybe you've got to install VS Code, totally run it in the cloud. Run it in DBT Cloud. There's a free tier, but bearing in mind that it is a pay-as-you-go consumption model. So as your models may get a little bit more complex and there's more things you want to run and you want to run it at a lower latency, it might cost more. It's what I see on forums, basically. I see people saying, well, hey, we started our DBT project in the cloud. We had a model that, we had 10 models, right? We had 10 tables and we loaded them once a day. Now we've got 100 models and we're loading them once an hour. Obviously, then they're seeing an increase, an increase in cost. Right, back to the medallion. Right, so with DBT, if we want to load a warehouse, we want to get the data from somewhere. Right, so for example, if we've got a lake house, if our favorite data engineer that we fed with pizza or whatever their favorite food is, and we've been very nice to them, they've created us somewhere a repository of the cleansed data from all the systems, right? We don't have to care about duplicates. We know the data is clean. We're going to work with it, all right? So we've got a lake house there that's sat with all our tabular data ready to be modeled, ready to go. We've earmarked the fact that we're going to use a warehouse, right? We might be using several warehouses in several workspaces. Yeah, let's say that we've devolved the construction of a data warehouse into data marts, and we've got a series of workspaces that are very specific to areas of the business, whatever. We want to get the data from the lake house. That's where DBT is essentially connecting to our chosen source, a lake house, and we can use statements to load that data out. Ultimately, under the hood, really what DBT is doing is running the SQL from the warehouse service using the three-part naming convention coming from the Lakehouse. This is why, at the moment, getting data or using a DBT project with data that sits in another workspace in the warehouse would be possible using a Lakehouse with shortcuts. dbt Spark, probably using ABFSS endpoints. So one of the powers of DBT is what we're doing with schema changes, i.e. we've got some new columns, or we've got some dropped columns that have come in, or data types, God forbid data types have changed. But the schema changes, right? And this is kind of why you really want to use DBT, because if the structure doesn't really change that much, you know, maybe DBT isn't really something that's needed. But if attributes are added quite frequently, I mean, the business is already, you know, is always defining new things that they want to measure by, you know, new dimensions, new columns. Yes, you know, DBT can handle that. So if we're loading certain types of models, tables that are incremental tables or they're snapshot tables, and we'll talk about that in a little while, there's a property exposed called onSchemaChange. This basically tells you, tell DBT what you want, what you want it to do when it detects changes in the source system. Right now, ignore, you think would just ignore and everything would be working fine, but no. If there's any new columns that's added to the source, it won't add those new columns. If any columns have vanished from the source, the DBT model will fail. It won't process. So, to my mind, it's not really ignoring it, then, is it? But that's what we have in DBT. Obviously, we can fail. So we can say, hey, any source detection changes, bang, we're going to fail the model. We're going to fail that particular table or view creation. Append new columns. Now, this is what's going to work in the Fabric Warehouse. And I'm just going to bring the last option up, and we're just going to go back to that statement. So we've also got sync all columns. It's actually sync all columns. The new is in there because I copied append new columns and didn't remove the word new. Sync all columns, which basically adds new columns, removes any deleted columns from the destination that don't exist in the source, and syncs data types. All right, so the sync all new columns is the do everything. Now, going back to this whole thing of Fabric Warehouse and what doesn't and doesn't work, at the moment, we can only do certain schema modifications in Fabric Warehouse tables. I won't talk about primary keys and foreign keys. Talking about columns, we can add columns to a table, alter table, add such and such. That works fine. But we can't drop a column from a table, and we can't alter a column's data type or rename it. Now, this is essentially because Microsoft has yet to put in the Delta table option that allows you to do that. So Delta has lots of different versions. I think we're up to version 4, which is probably still in preview. Each version introduces new features, right? So there has been new features added to Delta where identity columns have been added. Fabric Warehouse works with a specific version of Delta and incorporates specific functionality, which means it doesn't include a column mapping feature or column mapping based on IDs or internal IDs. We can't drop columns, which means that we can't sync all new columns, well, sync all columns, because if a column is dropped, it's going to fail with invalid syntax. And that's the thing. It will try and run the SQL. It will try and run the alter table drop column statement. It just won't be able to work. So append new columns works fine because any new columns will get added. Any existing columns in the destination that have been removed from the source, DBT will just ignore that column in the warehouse. So the column will still exist. It just won't be being populated anymore. Then in terms of incrementally loading data, we've got some incremental strategies. I'll jump straight to it. Fabric Fabric supports two, right? So if you set up a table to be an incremental table, which we're going to see in the demo, i.e. a fact table, we've got append data, right? Which basically means it's just going to insert the data into the fact table. So if we are extraordinarily confident and sure that the data coming in with a specific date type is new data, and we can just load it in using append, fantastic. If, and we live in the real world, some facts need to change, an existing fact needs to be updated, at the moment, we can use delete and insert. So essentially what that does is you have to introduce some keywords into your DBT model, which dictate what you want to happen. So for example, that code example is telling DBT that this model is an incremental model. The key is date, day. Yes, you can have multiple columns involved in this key. And the incremental strategy is delete and insert. So essentially what it will do is for a unique key that doesn't exist, it'll just insert it. For a unique key that does exist, it'll delete the column from the warehouse and insert the new row. So that's something to bear in mind. I'm very much hoping that merge is going to be made available at some stage. We'll have to see. So limitations and caveats. So I want to get to the demo. So I'm just going to bring them all up now. Ultimately, understand the T-SQL, what they call the surface area, which is understand the syntax. What is and isn't supported in the warehouse service. That'll tell you what you can and can't do with DBT, right? You tell DBT, I want you to run this SQL. I want you to run this type of incremental strategy, a model strategy. DBT doesn't say to you, hang on a minute, you're using a Fabric warehouse which doesn't support this. No, it's optimistic. It's going to run those SQL statements that it generates. So you need to be aware of that. But a drop and reload works wonders, right? So for example, if you do have a data mart or something that is a complete drop and recreate, no problem. You don't have to worry about incremental strategies. You don't have to worry about model strategies and syncing columns. It'll just drop the destination, reload it, no problem at all. Yeah, as we've discussed, model strategies, only a subset are supported because of the lack of full alter table support in the Fabric warehouse at the moment. There is something called ephemeral materialization, right? Now, I suppose materializations could be a whole session in and of themselves. Ultimately, you're asking DBT to materialize an object in a certain way. Do you want it as a table? Do you want it as a view? Sometimes you don't want any of those things. Sometimes you want a materialization that won't be persisted. So this could be for staging data, for transforming data. So there's a materialization type called ephemeral. But what that does, and this again, DBT doesn't care that it's the Fabric warehouse. It generates these nested CTE statements. Guess what isn't supported in the Fabric warehouse? Got it right. Nested CTEs for the time being. There is a workaround though, which is you literally just don't write a with statement, which is what you're supposed to do. But if you just write a select statement, it then wraps the with statement and deploys it. Works absolutely fine to me. And the other thing to be aware of, it's quite chatty with the warehouse, right? It's doing metadata querying. Yep. So every DBT run, it gets the metadata, right, for tables to understand, are there any changes? Do I need to do anything before I, load data? So it's something to be aware of. All right, so we're going to jump into a demo. So anyone got any questions before we jump in? Because what I'll do is I'll bring up my bring up the browser. Right.
There is one question from start.
Yeah.
Did I see
Sorry.
something about nested cities in Fabric February release notes?
Oops, hang on a minute. I'm just. Why is my? There we go. Nested CB. Oh, Stuart. Maybe they are supported. I don't know. They could be. I mean, all of a sudden, query plans showed up. I hadn't seen those on anything. If they are, fantastic. Then ephemeral materializations will work without the current workaround. Okay, brilliant. Preview, fine, brilliant. Yes, Stuart, you may have dreamed it, or it might have been a nightmare. You know, could be one of those two things. All right, okay. So the first thing now, I don't have any skin in the game with this, right? I haven't got any affiliation with these guys whatsoever. I need to make that clear. I'm not grifting any money off them. This is a great course, right? This uses DBT Core. It uses Snowflake, so you have to do a little bit of finagling to get it work with Fabric. Honestly, it's not that much effort at all. This will take you through how to install DBT, how to work with the power tools, all the different materializations, some best practices with DBT itself, hosting, running, scheduling, testing. It's great, really. It really is. And to be honest with you, it says £60 on there. I'm pretty sure if you logged in, it'll be about £12. DBT themselves, read some of the best practices as you're going along, especially things like how they structure their DBT projects, right? So as you're doing some learning or as you're working out how DBT can work with whatever source system you want, Fabric Warehouses, Databricks, etc., have a look at their best practices. They do, and vendors these days seem to do a really good job of providing training. I guess the more training that they provide, the better experience people are going to have with their products. So if you get onto the DBT website, then they've got their fundamentals, they've got a certification, or they've got two certifications actually. I'm working towards the analytics engineering certification, you know, at the moment, but there's loads of good stuff on there. Now we're talking about the flavors of DBT. Here's cloud. Right, we're not gonna hover on this too long, but essentially I can create a project in DBT Cloud. Don't have to use anything from my own computer other than a web browser, and I can get myself up and running. Yes, I need to provide a service principal to be able to work with the Fabric Warehouse, so I'll have to go into Azure and Entra and create an app ID registration, get the secret, add it here in terms of authorization. But the project, I can essentially duplicate and work with that project in VS Code. So this is what I mean about DBT Cloud running things. So if I ran the model to actually do the DBT work, I'm using the compute that DBT have provided. So yes, there is a free tier, but any kind of productionalized system at any scale, it might end up costing, you know, however much. I prefer to run it with VS Code. That then means I can run it on any compute that I want. I can deploy containers and deploy projects to that container. Here's a little sneak peek on Databricks. Shh, don't tell Microsoft or the Fabric team. But look, they have a task, right? If I just add a task to their workflows, right? A first-class entity in a Databricks workflow is a DBT model, right? And I can say, well, yeah, I've uploaded that model to the workspace. I can link it in with Git, and I can do all of my DBT commands that I want to run. Brilliant. And that'll use Databricks compute to run the DBT part of things, right? So it's being added in to these tools. I know there's other tools like SQL Mesh, but DBT is becoming like a first-class entity that is appearing. It did appear very quickly in data pipelines within Fabric and then disappeared again. We haven't heard anything yet. So I have a lake house, right? It's cleansed. But I've called the tables raw. Just ignore it. Imagine they're cleansed tables. I've got some dates, I've got some event types, some products, and I've got some web telemetry data that I actually want to analyze as part of my facts. If I go to VS Code, yes, I've installed DBT. It's probably out of the scope of this session, but like I said, if you go to that Udemy course, it tells you everything, right? And getting DBT set up isn't particularly difficult. It's a series of steps, probably take you about 15-20 minutes, no problem. So in our project, we've got some out of the box folders that get created, right? We want to pay attention to models. So in models, this is where we're defining our transformations. This is where we're defining what we want our downstream schema to look like. So for example, I want to bring in some raw data, right? I want to connect to my lakehouse and I want to create some views that go and get the relevant data from that lakehouse. I'm not going to save it to a downstream table because some of my other models are going to use these models to actually do the dimension creation or the fact creation. So the first thing I can do is look at sources, right? So I can tell DBT that I've got a source. I'm going to call it raw_lakehouse. Should have called it cleansed. Database, the LHDBT cleansed. So that's referencing that lakehouse in the workspace. And then for each table that I want to expose inside DBT, I'm going to give it the name of the table and then a description. That now means I can just reference this object name rather than having to reference an actual physical lakehouse. So for example, in my dates, right, as you can see, I don't care about dates as in it being materialized downstream, right? So I've got this configuration materialized as ephemeral. I've selected from my raw dates for event type. Yeah, I like that as a view. I'm going to create that as a view. I'm just getting all the data and I'm going to select specific columns. Same for products, right? But as you can see, I'm just defining a series of select statements. Now I could be doing all sorts of transformation in this statement. So I could be adding some derived columns. I could be, well, hopefully I'm not doing any data cleansing, right? Because that's already been done, right? But I can do some further transformation on that data. Again, web telemetry, it's just a view. These are the columns that I want to expose. So that's my raw. They're all, apart from dates, are going to be materialized as views. That then means what I can do is when I'm creating some dimensions and facts, if I go into dim date, right, I can use the super useful command, which is ref. Now that is what gives DBT the ability to build up that dependency. Ref stg dates tells DBT that the dim date model has a dependency on stg dates. So if you can imagine, maybe one of my dimensions has to load from 3 normalized tables. If you ref each of those, DBT knows that one table has a dependency on those 3 tables. So if those 3 tables are loaded from elsewhere, DBT will build the DAG to make sure those 3 tables get loaded before the downstream table gets loaded. So with product, I'm using an inbuilt utility, which is called generate surrogate key. So I'm going to create a product key hash. Again, we can do different things in our models. We can use, a row number if we wanted, right? There's some finagling to do to be able to get a row number working with existing data, right? One of the Fabric Warehouse workarounds is that you use this row number function, but you're appending the maximum value right? I'm just using a hash in this example with a utility. Again, I'm referencing stage products. So let's deploy that first, right? So what I'll do is in my terminal, let's just make sure DBT is all up and running and working. Yep, there we go. Let's just flick back very quickly to the warehouse. So at the moment, my gold warehouse got nothing in it. Right, I've got a DBO schema, but I'm not using it. I'm not going to add anything into that DBO schema, so it's completely empty. And the first thing that I'll do is I'll just get my dimensions added. So I'll add these 2 dimensions. We've got one more dimension to add, but I'm going to select some specific models. So I'm going to select from the raw folder, and I'm going to select from the star schema folder. I'm going to leave my fact for the time being. I also have a snapshot, which helps me work with slowly changing dimensions. I'll do that afterwards. So let's do that. Now, folder structures for models in DBT are navigated with a full stop rather than a slash. Right, so let's run this. If we go up in there, so as we can see, it's creating these views, creating the tables, because by default, so if I look at my DBT project file, I have told DBT that the default materialization is a table. That's why in dim product, I haven't got any configuration at the beginning to tell it, can you do it as a table or a view? If I want any other different type of materialization, I have to explicitly call it out in the model. All right. By default, it'll create those tables. So if I look at my warehouse, let's just do a refresh. There we go. You've got our new schema that got created, and we should see our tables come through. There we go, dim date, dim product. So let's just click on dim product, and we should have some data. There we go. All just DBT running that run command. I've got a snapshot. And again, this is, I guess DBT don't really want to align the naming of their functionality with specific things that it's useful for. So to my mind, snapshots are useful for slowly changing dimensions, but I guess you could use it for anything that you needed row versioning on. But with snapshots, right, we've got a folder called snapshots, and I've got a model, right? Now, the with statement and the select, nothing special. It's exactly as you'd find in any of the other models. I'm going to my stage event type view, which isn't special. It's just going to the lake house and getting the tables. However, the configuration at the top basically tells DBT what this is. It's a snapshot. Being a snapshot exposes certain functionality. One of those is managing row versioning. We've got to tell DBT what are you keying in off. So this would be, let's say we're looking at slowly changing dimensions. This is going to be your business key, right? That lets DBT do what it needs to do. What's the strategy? In my example, I've got a timestamp, right? So I've got a column in my source that indicates when a row has changed. Other strategies would be checking the values of columns, right? So look, we've all worked with source systems that are extremely useful and have no columns whatsoever to tell you what's changed other than the values in the columns. We can do that. It essentially uses a hash, a computed hash over the columns, right? But if we've got a source that does have some sort of timestamp, brilliant. I tell it what field I use. And then look, we've got that on schema change, right? So I'm going to tell DBT, if any new columns come in, I want you to append those new columns. Now we have control over adding these new columns. It's not just going to appear in our destination if it's added to the source. We are adding new columns in our selects, right? That's where we're defining the new columns if they're in the source. So ultimately what happens is, let me just run that. So I run the dbt snapshot command. dbt adds metadata to this table automatically and then manages that metadata when changes come in for the raw data. So let's have a little look at the warehouse. Let's have a look. Let's refresh that. I will come to your, Arno, I will come to your question. Just want to get through a few bits and pieces. So there we go, event type. Right, so there are our columns, right? And you can see we've got 4 metadata columns that get added. We've got like an intern, we've got an ID, we've got the valid from and to, we've got when a system generated update statement. So let's go in and just change some data. So I'll go down, I'm just going to update the event type. So marketing have said, we don't want to call this event purchased product. We want to call it bought product, but we kind of want to keep track of the things that we've done to rename certain things because we do some cohort analysis. Whatever marketing want, we need to row version that data in the warehouse. So there we go. Oh, look at that. Is it me or are starter pools getting quicker? 5 seconds to get that starter pool up and running. Let's have a look at the event type. And there we go. Right, so we changed it. We've got a last updated column in there as well. If I go back into DBT and run the snapshot again. If the source table itself is a CDC table, so the unique key now becomes the business key and a valid from or something. Well, so there is some extra, there is an incremental option available in the config where you can put some additional selection logic into if you need to do some further limiting of the data. That might be what you're looking for. However, a unique key can be not a concatenation. What's the word I'm looking for? Can be several columns, right? So it supports adding several columns. So if you did have a business key and you had a valid from or something, as long as you could join on those columns, yeah, that's what it's doing. It's joining on the columns. Right, let's go back and have a look at our warehouse. So actually, let's do a select and get the data. Okay, run that. Okay, haven't seen anything come through yet. Let's do another quick. I'm going to change it to today. Don't think that makes any difference to it at all. Run that. Let's get it from here. Yep, so we've changed it, and then let's just go into our Lakehouse. I just want to check the SQL endpoint. If anyone's worked with the Lakehouse and the SQL endpoints, then they might see some of the current frustrations here. Is I've quite clearly written changes to that Lakehouse table using Spark, and hey, I don't see it in my Lakehouse SQL endpoint. Let's just click that metadata sync. There is an undocumented API that has been, I think code has been put on Reddit and blogs to deal with it. There we go. Right, so there's our metadata. So it's important to understand that yes, DBT is talking to the Lakehouse SQL endpoint. That I probably should have called out earlier. Right, let's run our snapshot again. Right, now bearing in mind that all I've done is I've written a select statement. I haven't created a table. I haven't had to define my SCD columns. I've just written a select statement and added some config. Right, let's have a look again and see if we can see. There we go. Right. So what DBT has done is, well, there's our new column, or sorry, there's our new row, right? It's retired the old row. So we've got that DBT valid 2 has now been closed off. I've just used a date, right? Obviously that's a bit brute force, date time completely valid. But that's going to manage our slowly changing dimensions for us, or any process that we want downstream that we want row versioning on. People have been using DBT to load from raw into cleansed and do all of their cleansing routines. A lot of a lot of patterns state that in your cleansed environment, you also want to have row versioning, right? DBT can do that for you. Then in terms of the fact data, right? So what I'll do is I'm just going to run the fact loading. And I specified that as an incremental, right? So if I go into my fact, right, I've said it's an incremental. And any new columns that you find in the source that I define in my select statement, add them to the destination, ignore anything that doesn't exist, right? So that's what's going to work with Fabric warehousing. There's my select statement, as you can see. And it's this is or if is incremental, right? So the first time I run this, DBT says, I haven't run this before. It doesn't exist. We're going to do a full load. When you run it subsequently, this if is incremental is going to fire. And I define my limiting query in terms of that incremental. And I think I stated before, you can add further refining of the data in the config in an incremental option. Of course, if you want to not do appends and you want to do deletes and you want to do inserts for updates, because unfortunately we can only do delete and insert, this where clause would probably have to be off a modified date, for example. So if you could identify when data was new or modified, use a modified date. Then you're going to have to put your key columns in so that DBT knows how to do it. I am not to be blamed for Fabric Warehouse performance if you do an awful lot of deleting, okay? It doesn't really like it that much. Let's have a look. We do tables, we do a refresh, and we've got our fact table, right? There we go with our data, okay? And then the last thing before we finish off is, because it's incremental, if I go back into my notebook, all right, I've got some new data that I want to load, but I also want to get rid of a column. I don't need URL anymore. It's not relevant. I'm also going to add a new column. Now I'm just going to derive a column and say 1 as event category, right? Keep it simple. I think I'm pretty much on time, so I'll run this very quickly. And there we go. I'll write that into my Lakehouse table. Yes, there is. It'll be in the logs, Arno. Okay, so we've done that. Let's just write that. And that's where DBT Cloud is really good when you get up and running, because when it runs the models, it literally has the summarized and detailed windows there with everything that it's running. You can also use the query insights within Fabric Warehouse to see what is actually being run on the warehouse as well, which is really, really useful. Yeah, let's have a look and just make sure that we are updating our endpoint. All right, and then I'll run the fact once again. All right, so let's just run that. We go. Let me go back to our warehouse. Let's do a select top 100 of all. Okay, yeah, it won't appear in there because ultimately, even though that new column has been added, I haven't specified my event category column in here. If I added that column in, I could pull it through. So I think with that, if there's any more questions, I'm going to wrap up. I go back to my demo. I think the last thing is thank you. So thank you for your time. Like I said, feel free to reach out, LinkedIn. If you want any more details, let me know. But thank you for your time.